The moment every machine gives up is sometimes the moment a forgotten heart decides to fight. The steady rhythm of monitors filled the intensive care suite on the 12th floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center, but no one in the room believed those sounds would continue much longer. Dominic Castellano, the most influential businessman anyone in the city whispered about with equal parts admiration and caution, lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, while pale morning light spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Expensive suits, private jets, and an empire built through relentless discipline had brought him almost everything money could buy, yet none of it mattered inside room 1207. The nation's finest specialists had arrived from Boston, New York, and Los Angeles. They had reviewed every scan, every lab result, every treatment plan. They spoke in careful voices, exchanged exhausted glances, and quietly admitted what none of them wanted to say aloud. Medicine had reached its limit. One by one, physicians removed their gloves, closed thick patient files, and stepped away from the bedside with the heavy silence that follows when expertise runs out of answers. Outside the room, attorneys waited with sealed folders. Trusted executives whispered about emergency succession plans. Security personnel stood perfectly still in tailored black suits, watching every hallway as though protecting their employer from the world one final time. Yet behind all the authority, every face carried the same expression, helplessness. At the far corner of the room stood someone almost no one noticed. Naomi Carter adjusted the sleeves of her light blue scrubs, keeping her eyes lowered as she held a clipboard against her chest. At 27, she had been working the night shift for less than 6 months. She rarely spoke unless someone addressed her directly. Other nurses often mistook her quietness for insecurity, while senior physicians barely remembered her name. She preferred it that way. Invisible people heard everything. Invisible people also learned to recognize pain that words could never describe. As another specialist quietly zipped his medical bag, the attending physician released a slow breath and looked toward Dominic's legal advisor. "You should call the family," he said softly. "If there's anything they wish to say, now is the time." Those words floated across the room like cold winter air. Several people lowered their heads. One bodyguard looked toward the window instead of the bed, refusing to let anyone see the emotion gathering behind his eyes. Naomi remained perfectly still, yet something deep inside her refused to accept the silence settling over the room. She studied Dominic's face for only a second before looking away again. Everyone else saw a dying man whose body had surrendered. Naomi saw something different. She could not explain it. It wasn't a number on a monitor or a note inside a chart. It was simply a feeling she had learned years earlier while sitting beside another hospital bed, holding another hand everyone believed had already let go. As footsteps began leaving the room and conversations faded into the hallway, Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She swallowed hard, tightened her grip on the clipboard, and gathered every ounce of courage she possessed. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke the words no one expected to hear. "May I stay with him? Just for a few minutes." The attending physician looked up with tired eyes, surprised that the quietest person in the room had been the only one to speak. For a brief moment, nobody answered Naomi. The silence stretched across the polished floor as though even time itself had paused to consider her request. Finally, the physician gave a small nod. 5 minutes, he said gently. "There is nothing more we can do." One by one, the doctors walked into the hallway, their expensive shoes echoing against marble floors until the room became almost impossibly still. The bodyguards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances before following the medical team outside. Only the soft hum of life support equipment remained, blending with the distant sounds of elevators opening and closing somewhere beyond the intensive care wing. Naomi slowly placed her clipboard on a nearby chair and released a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding. She had stood beside countless hospital beds during overnight shifts, but this room felt different. Not because the patient was famous or powerful, not because newspapers called him untouchable. It felt different because loneliness had settled over the room long before illness ever had. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb the blankets, and studied Dominic's face in the gentle morning light. Without the tailored suits, commanding posture, and confident voice the world knew, he looked almost unfamiliar. The lines of responsibility remained across his forehead, but every trace of authority had been replaced by simple human vulnerability. Naomi had seen that expression once before. 8 years earlier, she had watched it appear on her own father's face as cancer slowly stole his strength. Back then, she had been a college student with no medical training, only a frightened daughter determined never to let him feel abandoned. Every evening, she sat beside his hospital bed reading old family stories, humming the songs he loved, and speaking to him even when the nurses believed he could no longer hear her. They often reminded her that unconscious patients rarely responded. Her father never opened his eyes again, but on his final night, he had squeezed her hand so gently that no monitor could have measured the comfort she felt. From that moment forward, Naomi carried one belief that no textbook had ever taught her. Hearing was sometimes the last bridge between two hearts. That belief had quietly shaped every decision she made after becoming a registered nurse. She always introduced herself to patients who could not answer. She always explained every medication before giving it. She always wished them good morning, even if they seemed asleep. Some coworkers smiled politely at her habits. Others called them unnecessary. Naomi never argued. Kindness did not require permission. She pulled a chair beside Dominic's bed and sat carefully, leaving several inches between herself and the mattress as though respecting invisible boundaries. Outside the window, sunlight reflected against the glass towers of downtown Chicago while traffic slowly awakened below. Inside the room, every second seemed suspended between hope and goodbye. Naomi folded her trembling hands together, looked at the man everyone believed had already slipped beyond their reach, and spoke with the same calm warmth she once reserved for her father. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano. My name is Naomi. I know everyone thinks you cannot hear me, but I hope they are wrong because I think no one should have to face silence alone." Naomi allowed the quiet to settle naturally before speaking again, never rushing the silence because she had learned that silence often carried its own language. The morning sun climbed a little higher, warming the room with soft golden light that reflected across polished floors and stainless steel equipment. Somewhere outside, a helicopter crossed the skyline, its distant sound fading almost as quickly as it arrived. Inside room 1207, nothing appeared to change. Dominic Castellano remained perfectly still, his breathing supported by the machines that surrounded him. Yet Naomi refused to believe that stillness meant absence. She reached for a small washcloth resting beside the sink, dampened it with warm water, and gently wiped one of Dominic's hands. Moving with the same quiet respect she showed every patient regardless of their name or reputation. His hands surprised her. They were larger than she expected, marked with faint scars and years of hard work that expensive watches had never managed to hide. Newspapers often described him as a man who controlled boardrooms with a single sentence and negotiated impossible deals without showing emotion. Hospital employees whispered stories whenever his security team appeared in the lobby. Some believed he inspired fear wherever he walked. Others insisted he never smiled. Naomi had never cared much for stories told in break rooms because stories rarely captured the whole person. Every patient arrived carrying chapters the world never bothered to read. She looked toward the family photographs someone had quietly arranged on a shelf beside the window. One showed Dominic standing beside an elderly woman whose smile carried unmistakable pride. Another captured him, sitting on a dock at sunset with a young boy holding a fishing rod that looked almost twice his size. There was also a faded photograph of a little girl laughing while reaching for bubbles drifting through summer air. Naomi studied those pictures for several seconds, realizing they revealed more about the man than any headline ever could. Powerful people were almost always introduced through their achievements. Ordinary people were remembered through the ones they loved. Perhaps that was the greatest difference between public image and private truth. She smiled softly before returning her attention to the quiet figure resting before her. "You must have made someone laugh like that," she whispered, glancing toward the photograph of the little girl. "Nobody keeps pictures like these unless they mattered." The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Nothing dramatic happened. Naomi did not expect anything dramatic. She believed healing often began long before anyone could measure it. She pulled the chair a little closer and folded her hands once more. "You know," she continued gently, "when my father was here, I used to tell him about ordinary things. The weather, the neighbors, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. I wanted him to remember that life was still waiting outside his window. She paused, listening to the quiet hum surrounding them. So today it is 68 degrees outside. The lake is calm. The city is waking up. Somewhere a bakery is pulling fresh bread out of the oven, and people are hurrying to work because they think today is just another Tuesday. They have no idea how precious an ordinary morning really is. As her words drifted through the room, she noticed the sunlight slowly reaching Dominic's face, softening the sharp features that had intimidated so many people for years. For the first time since entering the room, Naomi felt certain she was not speaking into emptiness. She could not explain why. She simply felt that somewhere beyond the silence, someone was still listening. Naomi remained beside the bed, allowing the gentle rhythm of her breathing to match the quiet cadence of the machines. She had long ago discovered that calm could be contagious, even inside places where hope seemed to disappear. The clock on the wall marked another 10 minutes, although she could have sworn only seconds had passed. Beyond the closed door, faint conversations drifted through the hallway as specialists discussed reports filled with numbers, charts, and conclusions. Every decision had been documented. Every treatment had been attempted. Every respected opinion had reached the same destination. There was nothing left to offer except time. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at Dominic. People think the hardest part is saying goodbye, she whispered. I do not think that is true. I think the hardest part is believing someone is already gone while they are still here. She remembered standing in another hospital years before, watching visitors slowly stop coming because they believed there was nothing left to say. Her father had never complained about being alone, but she could always see the disappointment hidden behind his tired smile whenever another empty afternoon passed without familiar voices. That memory stayed with her every day she wore nursing scrubs. Illness could weaken the body, but loneliness quietly exhausted the spirit. Naomi reached toward the window and adjusted the blinds just enough to let more sunlight enter the room without becoming uncomfortable. Warm rays settled across the blanket covering Dominic's hands, creating a peaceful glow that softened the clinical atmosphere. She smiled faintly. My father always liked the morning sun, she said. He said it reminded him that every day deserved at least one chance before anyone decided how it would end. Her voice remained steady, gentle enough to blend with the soft mechanical sounds surrounding them. She began describing ordinary moments again, painting simple pictures with her words. She spoke about children laughing in nearby parks during spring afternoons, about neighbors greeting one another while walking their dogs, about the smell of rain on warm sidewalks after summer storms. None of those stories seemed important by themselves, yet together they carried something larger. They reminded people what life actually felt like outside hospital walls. As Naomi continued speaking, she noticed something so subtle she almost dismissed it as imagination. The steady line on the heart monitor remained unchanged, yet one fingertip resting beneath the blanket appeared slightly less rigid than before. She leaned closer without touching him, carefully watching for several seconds. Nothing else moved. A less experienced observer might have convinced themselves they had imagined it, but Naomi trusted careful observation more than quick conclusions. She did not call for anyone. She did not rush toward the door. Instead, she quietly said, "If that was you trying to answer, you do not have to hurry. I am still here." Another peaceful silence settled over the room. Outside, the city continued racing through another ordinary morning, completely unaware that inside one quiet hospital room, a young nurse everyone overlooked had chosen to stay when everyone else believed there was nothing left worth waiting for. And somewhere beneath the silence, beneath exhaustion, beneath every prediction written inside expensive medical charts, the smallest spark of hope seemed unwilling to disappear. Naomi glanced toward the closed door and listened until the final footsteps faded down the hallway. The room felt strangely protected now, wrapped in a quiet that no longer seemed empty, but deeply personal. She rested her hands in her lap and allowed herself to remember the last conversation she had shared with her father. He had smiled through his exhaustion and whispered something she would carry for the rest of her life. Never let anyone leave this world believing they were forgotten. At the time, she thought he was speaking only about himself. Years later, she realized he had been giving her a purpose. Every patient deserved to be seen. Every frightened heart deserved companionship, and every goodbye deserved kindness. Naomi looked back at Dominic and spoke with the same warmth she once reserved for the man who had raised her. I do not know what memories you are holding on to, Mr. Castellano. Maybe you are remembering your mother. Maybe you are thinking about someone you wish you had one more chance to see. Maybe you are simply tired. Whatever you are carrying, you do not have to carry it alone. A gentle breeze stirred the edge of the window blinds, sending narrow ribbons of sunlight across the blanket. The golden light reached Dominic's face, softening the stern features that had intimidated so many people for decades. For a brief moment, he no longer resembled the powerful figure whose name commanded attention throughout the city. He looked like an ordinary man who had traveled a very long road and simply needed someone willing to stay until the end. Naomi reached for his hand again, careful and respectful, lightly resting her fingertips against the back of his without applying pressure. His skin felt cool but peaceful. She closed her eyes for only a second and silently hoped that wherever his thoughts had wandered, they could still hear compassion. Then she leaned forward just enough for her voice to remain gentle without becoming distant. When my father was afraid, I always reminded him that love does not disappear just because we cannot see it. It stays. It waits. Sometimes it is carried in a familiar voice. Sometimes it is carried in a simple touch. She opened her eyes again, noticing the calm expression that rested across Dominic's face. An overwhelming feeling of gratitude filled her heart, not because she expected a miracle, but because she had been given the chance to offer comfort when comfort mattered most. Acting only on instinct, with complete innocence and the same affectionate gesture she had once given her father during his final moments, Naomi gently leaned forward and placed a soft kiss upon Dominic's forehead, a quiet expression of compassion that carried no expectation except that no human being should face life's final chapter without tenderness. The room remained perfectly still. The monitors continued their measured rhythm. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. Naomi whispered, "You are not alone." She stayed exactly where she was, refusing to rush away from the simple act of kindness. Seconds drifted by with almost unbearable silence until, somewhere beneath the steady chorus of machines, the faintest change began to emerge, so subtle that only someone who had chosen patience over certainty could have noticed it first. Naomi did not move. She remained seated beside the bed, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the mattress as the quiet stretched into another long moment. The gentle kiss she had placed upon Dominic's forehead had not been an attempt to change fate. It had simply been the last kindness she knew how to offer. The monitor continued its familiar rhythm, filling the room with steady electronic tones that blended into the peaceful silence. Then, almost too quietly to notice, one sound changed. It was not louder. It was not dramatic. It was simply different. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the screen, wondering if she had imagined it. The heartbeat remained stable, yet its pattern carried a subtle strength that had not been there before. She looked back at Dominic's face, searching without expectation. Another second passed. Then another. Suddenly, the fingers beneath the blanket made the slightest movement, so delicate that it could easily have been dismissed as coincidence. Naomi leaned forward, careful not to disturb him. She had learned years ago that hope became dangerous when it raced ahead of evidence. Still, something inside her whispered that this moment deserved attention. She gently spoke his name once more. Mr. Castellano. There was no immediate response. She waited. Patience had always been her greatest teacher. Then the movement came again, this time unmistakable. One finger slowly curled before relaxing once more. Naomi pressed the nurse call button without taking her eyes away from the bed. Within seconds, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway as the attending physician, 2 specialists, and several nurses entered the room. They expected another routine update. Instead, they found Naomi quietly pointing toward Dominic's hand. Nobody spoke at first. Every pair of eyes focused on the patient. One physician stepped closer, carefully observing the monitor before checking Dominic's pupils with a small examination light. Another specialist looked at the screen twice, convinced an instrument had malfunctioned. "Check every connection," someone said. Calmly, a nurse quickly confirmed each cable and sensor. Everything was functioning exactly as it should. The room grew remarkably still. Then, before anyone could offer another explanation, Dominic drew a slightly deeper breath than he had at any point that morning. The attending physician looked toward the monitor again, then back to his patient, unable to hide the surprise spreading across his face. "Dominic," he said clearly, leaning closer. "If you can hear my voice, try to open your eyes." Several endless seconds passed. Naomi quietly folded her hands together, saying nothing. She did not pray for a miracle. She simply hoped the man before her would know someone had stayed. Then, almost imperceptibly, Dominic's eyelids trembled. The movement was so faint that one of the younger nurses blinked, wondering if exhaustion had fooled her eyes. A second later, the eyelids moved again, this time opening just enough to reveal a narrow glimpse of tired blue eyes struggling against the bright morning light. A collective breath filled the room. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. The silence itself became the loudest sound. Dominic's gaze drifted slowly across unfamiliar faces before stopping on Naomi. He looked confused, exhausted, and unable to speak, yet his eyes remained fixed on the quiet young nurse standing beside him. In that single unbroken moment, surrounded by specialists who had exhausted every answer they possessed, the only face he seemed able to recognize belonged to the person who had simply refused to let him be alone. The hours that followed unfolded with quiet precision as the intensive care unit transformed from a place of resignation into one of cautious expectation. Additional examinations confirmed what every specialist had witnessed with their own eyes. Dominic's condition had stabilized beyond every reasonable prediction. No physician claimed to understand why the sudden improvement had happened when it did, and no one rushed to describe it as anything more than an unexpected turn. Medicine had done everything it could, and now recovery would have to reveal its own story one day at a time. Naomi quietly returned to her regular responsibilities. Before sunrise faded into afternoon, she checked medications for other patients, comforted anxious families, and answered call lights with the same gentle patience she had always shown. She never mentioned what had happened inside room 1207. When curious nurses approached her during lunch asking how she had managed to stay so calm, she simply smiled and answered that every patient deserved someone who believed they could still be heard. The following morning, Dominic opened his eyes for longer than a few seconds. His breathing grew steadier, and the physicians began asking simple orientation questions. His answers came slowly, interrupted by exhaustion, but his mind remained remarkably clear. He remembered very little about the previous several days. There were no vivid dreams, no extraordinary visions, and no dramatic memories. Only 3 impressions remained untouched by the fog that surrounded everything else. A gentle voice, a feeling of peace, and the unmistakable warmth of someone who had refused to leave. Late that afternoon, after another successful examination, Dominic quietly looked toward his attending physician. His voice was weak but steady enough to carry across the room. "There was someone here." The physician nodded politely. "Many people visited you." Dominic slowly shook his head. "Not many." He paused to gather another breath. "One." The room became still. "A young nurse," he continued. "She spoke as if she already knew me." The physician exchanged a brief glance with another nurse before asking, "Do you remember her name?" Dominic closed his eyes, searching through scattered fragments that refused to become complete memories. Finally, he answered with quiet certainty, "No, but I remember kindness." Those words lingered in the room long after they were spoken. Later that evening, Dominic called for his chief of security, a man who had served beside him for more than 20 years. The older gentleman entered respectfully, relieved to see his employer awake again. Dominic looked toward him with calm determination that surprised everyone present. "Find the nurse who stayed after everyone else left," he said softly. "Not because she did something extraordinary, because she did something no one else thought was important." The chief of security nodded without asking another question. He had spent decades carrying out difficult assignments, yet this request felt unlike any he had ever received. Meanwhile, Naomi finished another 12-hour shift, changed into a simple navy sweater, and walked toward the employee parking garage carrying the same worn canvas bag she had owned since nursing school. She never imagined that one quiet morning inside a silent hospital room had become the only memory a man with everything could not forget, or that before another sunrise arrived, one simple act of compassion would begin changing 2 lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. 3 days later, sunlight poured through the windows of the recovery suite, where Dominic now sat upright for short periods, the color slowly returning to his face. The physicians smiled more often, their conversations replacing uncertainty with careful optimism. Every new examination confirmed that his strength was returning steadily, even if no one could fully explain why the turning point had arrived so unexpectedly. Dominic accepted every medical update with quiet gratitude, yet one question continued to occupy his thoughts far more than laboratory reports or treatment plans. He wanted to understand the person whose calm voice had remained with him when every other memory had disappeared. His chief of security returned that afternoon carrying a thin employee file instead of the thick investigative reports Dominic was accustomed to seeing. He placed it gently on the bedside table without speaking. Dominic opened the folder and found a simple identification photograph. Naomi Carter smiled shyly into the camera, wearing plain blue scrubs and no jewelry except a small silver cross resting beneath her collar. There were no awards listed beside her name, no impressive accomplishments, no influential connections. She had graduated from a public nursing program, worked evening and overnight shifts, volunteered twice a month at a neighborhood hospice center, and consistently received comments from patients describing her with the same words: kind, patient, gentle, present. Dominic continued reading until he reached a brief note included by the hospice director. It explained that Naomi had first become a volunteer after losing her father to cancer 8 years earlier. During his final months, she rarely left his bedside because she believed nobody should spend their last hours feeling abandoned. After his passing, she promised herself that every patient she encountered would receive the same compassion she had wished for him. Dominic slowly closed the folder and rested his hand upon it. The room remained completely silent. For the first time in many years, numbers, contracts, and business strategies felt remarkably small compared with a single promise made by a grieving daughter. He looked toward the family photographs resting near the window and quietly remembered his own mother, who had spent her life reminding him that true character revealed itself not through power, but through the way a person treated those who could offer nothing in return. Somewhere along the path toward success, he realized he had measured people by influence instead of kindness. That realization settled heavily upon his heart, not as guilt, but as clarity. Later that evening, Naomi arrived for another overnight shift, completely unaware that Dominic had learned pieces of her story. She stepped into the recovery room carrying fresh linens and a warm smile identical to the one she offered every patient. Before she could begin checking the equipment, Dominic looked toward her with calm blue eyes that were now fully awake. "Miss Carter," he said softly, speaking her name for the first time. Naomi paused in surprise. "Yes, Mr. Castellano." He held her gaze for a quiet moment before answering with complete sincerity. "I finally remembered what stayed with me." She waited patiently, unsure what he meant. Dominic smiled gently, a smile that surprised even himself. It was never the room. It was never the machines. It was never the fear. It was the kindness. And I realized that kindness was the one thing I had spent my entire life searching for without knowing it had been standing beside my bed all along. 6 months later, the top floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center looked very different from the place where silence had once settled like a final farewell. Sunlight still poured through the same windows each morning, but now it illuminated a newly dedicated center designed for patients facing life's most difficult moments. The bronze plaque beside the entrance carried a simple inscription that reflected the lesson one man had almost learned too late. No one should face their hardest day alone. Dominic Castellano attended the dedication without the attention that usually followed him. There were no dramatic speeches about his recovery and no attempts to explain what medicine could not fully explain. Instead, he stood quietly among physicians, nurses, volunteers, and families who had gathered to celebrate something much greater than one person's survival. The center would provide emotional support, counseling, family spaces, and compassionate care regardless of a patient's financial circumstances. Dominic had personally funded every room, but he insisted that his name appear nowhere on the building. He believed the place should honor kindness rather than generosity that expected recognition. When reporters later asked why he had made such an extraordinary gift, he smiled softly and answered with only a few words. "Someone reminded me what truly saves people." Across the room, Naomi continued preparing supplies for another overnight shift, wearing the same neatly pressed blue scrubs and carrying the same worn canvas bag she had owned since nursing school. Her life had changed very little on the outside. She still greeted every patient by name. She still explained every medication before administering it. She still sat beside those who had no visitors and filled empty rooms with gentle conversation about ordinary mornings, fresh coffee, changing seasons, and the quiet beauty of everyday life. The only noticeable difference was the way others now watched her. Physicians who had once overlooked her now paused to listen when she spoke. New nurses quietly followed her example, learning that compassion was not an extra task added to medical care, but an essential part of it. One evening, as Naomi finished arranging flowers in a patient's room, Dominic stopped beside the doorway. His strength had fully returned, but something even more important had changed. The restless determination that once drove every decision had been replaced by a calm confidence rooted in gratitude. He looked around the peaceful room before turning toward Naomi. "You know," he said gently, "I spent years believing the strongest people were the ones who never needed anyone." Naomi smiled with her usual quiet warmth. "And what do you believe now?" Dominic glanced toward the window where the evening sun painted the sky with shades of gold and amber. "I believe the strongest people are the ones who choose kindness when nobody is watching." Naomi lowered her eyes with humble gratitude, saying nothing because she had never sought praise for doing what she believed every human being deserved. The room settled into comfortable silence, the kind that no longer carried fear but peace. Outside, the city continued moving through another ordinary evening, unaware that one quiet act of compassion had forever changed the heart of a man who once believed power was life's greatest measure. Long after the lights dimmed and another shift began, the memory of that quiet hospital room continued to live in every life touched by the center they had inspired together. And on that day, everyone who walked through those doors was gently reminded that the greatest legacy a person can leave behind is not influence, wealth, or reputation, but the simple decision to make another human being feel seen.